Hello, and welcome to this session of POLIN Book Talks. I'm Anita Norich, Professor Emerita of English and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, and currently academic advisor to the Center for Jewish History's Fellowship Program. The discussion we're about to have is inspired by Allison Schachter's wonderful new book, Women Writing Jewish Modernity, 1919 to 1939, and it's my honor to be able to introduce our speakers. Allison Schachter is Associate Professor of English, Jewish Studies, and Russian and East European Studies at Vanderbilt University, where she's currently chair of the Department of Jewish Studies. She's the author of Diasporic Modernisms, Hebrew and Yiddish Literatures in the 20th Century, and of course, of the book we're talking about today, Women Writing Jewish Modernity, which appeared this year. Along with Jordan Finken, she's also the co-translator of Fradl Shtok's selected stories from the Jewish provinces. And she's currently working on a project, actually she's currently working on two projects, one on Cold War Jewish and African-American women's writings, as well as a new translation of Rachel Bruch's short fiction. Anastasiya Lyubas is the author of Blooming Spaces, the collected poetry, prose, critical writing, and letters by Dvora Vogel. Last year, the volume was the recipient of honorable mention from the MLA's Aldo and Jean Scaglione Prize for a translation of a literary work. Congratulations on that. She's also the author of White Words, Essays, Letters, Reviews, and Polemics by Dvora Vogel, which was published in Kyiv in 2019. And is a translation of Vogel's works into Ukrainian. She's been a visiting research fellow at the Northrop Frye Center for Comparative Literature at the University of Toronto, a research fellow at Ryerson University, a Max Weinreich fellow at YIVO, translation fellow at the Yiddish Book Center, and a Fulbright scholar. Karolina Szymaniak is assistant professor at the Taube Department of Jewish Studies at the University of Wrocław, and a research fellow at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. She received the 2016 Polityka History Prize for her edition of Rachel Auerbach's writings in the Warsaw Ghetto. She's the author of a monograph examining the aesthetic views of Dvora Vogel. She's also an editor of Warsaw Yiddish Avant-Garde and of My Wild Goat, Anthology of Yiddish Women Poets. Her edition of Malka Lee's Durch kindische Augen, the first academic edition of Lee's memoirs, will appear later this year. Allison's book also considers the work of Dvora Vogel, along with Fradl Shtok, Leah Goldberg, Elisheva Bikhovsky, and Grace Paley, thus considering works that span continents and languages. Before we turn to Allison, I'd like to remind you that you can post questions at any time during this discussion on your YouTube channel. And now I'm delighted to turn to Allison Schachter.
Thank you, Anita, for that really generous introduction. I want to thank Antony Polonsky and the POLIN Museum for inviting me into this conversation, and John Wozniakowski for helping with logistics. And I'm very grateful to Anita, Anastasiya, and Karolina for engaging with my work. They're three amazing scholars of Jewish women's writing and intellectual life, and my scholarship is definitely in conversation and indebted to their work. We know too little about the women writers, artists, and intellectuals who participated in and shaped modern Jewish culture, though we're learning more by the day. Their absence in literary and cultural history means we understand less about Jewish modernity than scholars realize. The underlying assumption that's governed the field of modern Jewish culture and literature is that women are absent for good reason. They weren't as talented or productive or significant. And for this reason, they were missing from syllabi and from literary and historical scholarship, from anthologies. Many remained until very recently untranslated. These absences continue to make it difficult for new generations of scholars to recognize the full extent of Jewish cultural transformation in the 20th century. Women writers responded to the changes that modernity brought in ways that often differed from men, not least because for many women, modernity's disruption of religion's gender hierarchy was a source of possibility and not only anxiety. Jewish women experimented with new aesthetic practices, embraced new political and artistic affiliations, and challenged a patriarchal social order. They took advantage of openings in cultural production, composed poems, wrote plays, published novels, and founded literary journals. And they achieved all this as male authority was being reconfigured in new secular institutions. But the project of recovering women writers has been very much devalued in Jewish literary studies as a feminist venture that destroys literary standards. And it's been overshadowed also by a focus on Jewish masculinity as the central story of Jewish modernity. Now, masculinity was a dominant category of Jewish difference in Europe, and Jewish men were thought to be effeminate and sort of inappropriately gendered. And as many critics noted, Jews internalized these depictions and in turn produced a new ethos of masculinity embodied in such representations as the new Hebrew man. But scholars have accepted this narrative of Jewish masculinization as shorthand for the gendered transformations of Jewish modernity, effectively erasing the complexity of women's historical experience and gendering Jewish modernity as masculine. The study of Jewish modernity, including Jewish masculinity, not only is impoverished without Jewish women's experiences, but also presents a fundamentally one-sided, flawed understanding of modern Jewish culture in the 20th century. And I'm gonna share my screen for a second, just so a few images. Okay, this might not work. Can you guys see
it's working?
Okay.
Yes.
So in my book, Women Writing Jewish Modernity, I set out to reckon both with women's absence from the historical record and to show how including women changes our understanding of modernity. I focused on prose, short stories, and novels in particular because secular prose fiction played an important social and cultural role in the 20th century and was the site of women's greatest exclusion. Women Writing Jewish Modernity looked at the works of 5 interwar women writers. Fradl Shtok, Dvora Baron, Elisheva Bikhovsky, Leah Goldberg, and Debora Vogel, bringing together voices of Hebrew and Yiddish women. I uncovered a transnational Hebrew and Yiddish feminist modernist aesthetic. These women were writing in an era when the literary emerged as a key stage of new cultural authority. Let me just change this. They lived and wrote in Poland, the Soviet Union, New York, Mandatory Palestine in the interwar period. And you can see from this map the various journeys they took and the transformations of borders that they experienced. Placing them in conversation with one another, I show how they shaped new social, cultural, and literary experiments to reimagine the basis of Jewish culture beyond the traditionally male homosocial world of Jewish letters. In their work, they probed the porous boundaries between Jewish and non-Jewish culture, asking pointed questions about the necessity of them. They identified as minority writers in worlds where minority identities were rapidly remade with the breakdown of the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires and the rise of new nation states. And as such, they portrayed the tension between minority particularity and the universalizing force of modernity through women's intimate desires and through their artistic practices. So I focus in the book on the interwar period in particular as a moment of radical transformation when new forms of national identity and minority rights emerged. The Polish Minority Treaty, the post-war mandate system, which divided the Ottoman Empire and German colonial empire into territorial mandates, and Soviet minority policy. In the same period, additionally, women gained hard-fought enfranchisement across the globe, including in the Soviet Union in 1917, Poland in 1918, and the US in 1920. And these new rights promised new freedoms, but those freedoms were contingent on the social conditions that structured women's and minorities' access to the privileges of citizenship and the protection of the law. So women's experience of these transformations are central to understanding Jewish minority life in Europe. But we cannot simply recover their voices and imagine that those narratives will change. This is really the challenge. Instead, we must document the labor conditions under which women struggled, along with the social violence that hampered their careers and expelled them from the literary record. Only then can we reorient the very grounds of our understanding of modernity. We also need to find new approaches and methodologies to Jewish cultural and literary histories that can encompass women's experiences. When historians and critics turn to illustrative examples of Hebrew and Yiddish modernism, they turn to the men because so far men's stories illuminate familiar narratives we already know that shape our understanding of Jewish literary history, continuing to exclude women. My point here is not that we need to biographize women's writing, but rather show how women's different experiences shape the fate of their writing and their aesthetic projects. So I briefly just want to reflect on one of the challenges that I faced in writing the book, which was actually identifying modernist Yiddish women prose writers about whom I actually came to realize I didn't know very much. In fact, I wasn't even sure they existed. And of course, now we know they exist, many of them. So I recalled that stashed away in my files was the interwar Galician journal Zuster, which included several women writers. And there I read Rachel Auerbach's review of Fradl Shtok's short story collection. I knew of Shtok as a widely anthologized poet who was credited with writing the first sonnets in Yiddish, a misattribution, but a telling one. And after reading her stories, I realized that I'd unconsciously accepted the maxim I had once heard that all the, quote, good works of Yiddish had already been translated. This led to my translation project with Jordan Finken of Shtok's collected stories, and you can see that here. But also to my approach to writing this book, which seeks not just to add women to narratives of Jewish modernisms, but to rethink the narratives entirely, to see how women's experiences shape their literary projects. So I think Shtok's story is a really interesting one because according to Yiddish literary lore in 1919, after reading the poet and editor Leah Goldberg's review of her collection, a review that he entitled, and you can see here, Temperament, because he wanted to accuse her of being a temperamental woman, she supposedly stormed into the offices of Der Taube, slapped him across the face, and dramatically broke all ties with Yiddish literature, dying sometime in a mental institution in the 1930s. As early as 1927, Malachrovich observed that Shtok's writing was rapturously received until one day she disappeared because of, quote unquote, some little incident in which her, quote, hysteria won out, proving she was more woman than poet. But if you read the chapter, you'll see that she didn't quickly disappear, that she was writing through the 1940s. And here is sort of her correspondence with the New York editor, Abe Kahan, in which she publishes a story in the 1940s. But she does retreat from the public world of Yiddish letters, dying alone, actually quite tragically, at Rockland State Psychiatric Hospital, I think in the 1990s. And here you can see a Social Security certificate that mentions the sort of mental institution case. Then was her married name. She was married and divorced. I thought that I included the grave marker here, but there's a grave marker from Blaisdell Cemetery that also includes an image of a gravestone that is likely hers with 1990 as the death. So Shtok's story actually resonates with that of other women writers in the book. For example, Elisheva Bikhovsky, a Hebrew writer who emigrated to Palestine in the 1920s with her husband, Shimon Bikhovsky, was celebrated as this Ruth-like figure, a non-Jewish woman who had embraced Hebrew until her husband passed away. But by 1947, in a letter to Major General Fitzroy MacLean, MP head of the Special Refugee Commission in England, she petitioned to be granted refugee status in Great Britain, explaining, quote, that she had positively no vital interest in the life of the Jewish community of Palestine, where I've had my residence for the last 20 years, no property or business of any kind, no family or other intimate relations, no regular professional work, and no part whatsoever in the manifold activities of the Jewish population here. And her story connects with the Hebrew writer Dvora Baron, who also famously retreated from the public sphere into her home in the 1920s. And I mention these together because one of the things that became very clear to me in writing this book is that individual stories about women's fragility or breakdown actually need to be rethought and understood as part of a larger social problem that women writers faced that led them to retreat from the public literary sphere. These women's work reflects the struggle to seek recognition in societies that devalued women's labor and created institutional and material roadblocks for women writers seeking publication. And in the book, I link these women's writings to the central historical and aesthetic questions of the interwar period, including nationalism, new forms of minority rights and suffrage. The book asks what women writers have to tell us about the history of Jewish culture and about Jewish radicalism and Jewish modernity more broadly.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you. There are so many points in both in the book and in your very brief overview of it that it's hard to know exactly where to begin. But I was struck, among the other things, with the statement, the question that you are asked, which I know each of us has been asked, which is pick an author. Is this work any good, or is it just interesting historically, right? And I wonder both how you answer that and how the rest of us would answer questions like that.
Well, I'll just say that of course that's the question I think we've all been asked, right? Well, is she really good? You know, it's a question I've continued to face. And one, I think, you know, when I was reading the Fradl Shtok stories, I was like, these are incredible. And how have I never heard of them? And so I think there's two parts to it, which is that if we don't read these women and we don't write and think about them, then what's so brilliant about their aesthetic projects remains hidden from view. And it's really easy to just make these assumptions, right? We didn't read them back then, or of course, some of them were read back then. They didn't make it to the record. They must not be good. You're just adding these women. But I'd say additionally that the aesthetic parameters that we've used to analyze and think through Yiddish literature has also been so rooted in men's biography and men's stories that I think their projects haven't always been legible, especially in the short fiction, you know, when we only have individual stories and anthologies and we're not getting to see the breadth of an individual woman's writer's work. It's hard to interpret and understand the project and see what they're doing. But when we move away from just allowing men's biographies and men's writing to be the standard by which we evaluate and start to develop our own standards, then I think things change.
I think that word standard is crucial in this consideration. Anastasiya, did you want to add?
To kind of build off of what Allison was saying, I think this is also a question of genre, which, you know, Allison's work engages with in trying to map these multiple geographies, multiple languages, and importantly, you know, tremendous output that women's contributions to secular prose writing. I think what Allison is trying to do, and you know, many of us are trying to do, is uncover the breadth and the span of women's writing. And in asking, you know, if we are being asked, is the work really good? The question sometimes comes from a place where, you know, is the woman writer, how serious is she? Has she created substantial works of fiction, or is she just a dabbler? You know, did she kind of write poetry and this was it? Did she create any critical pieces? You know, are there any essays? Is there substantial correspondence? You know, in presenting the work of these women writers, these wonderful case studies that Allison did, I think all the readers will see that there is a lot of connections that are being missed. You know, the work of recovery is political, is feminist, and is still very important even in 2022.
So I'd say, I mean, where I come from, and I combined Polish studies and Jewish studies when I started my academic career. So this question, I was asked this question, but about Yiddish literature in general. So for example, when I was applying for my Ph.D. program, I was asked, like, is it worth anything? Like what you're, you know, we don't know them. So is it worth anything, or is it just, you know, historical? So these are intersectional. I mean, also, I mean, those identities, and we see it, and Allison shows it beautifully in her book. I mean, how these multiple identities, I mean, being a woman, being a Jewish writer, being a Yiddish writer, and deciding to become a Yiddish writer, I mean, how they contributed to their revolutionary projects of modernity. And this book, I mean, also in its structure, really waves those different threads into a wonderfully engaging architecture of scholarship, and this is really exciting. I mean, when I was reading it and seeing how you really combine these topics, and when you know how you're able to wave them into an academic, I mean, texture. Yeah, and that's what I would like to say. So this was really exciting. I think this was one of the best things, I mean, among many other things, but really this experience of intellectual project that is really reflected in the intellectual structure of the book. But the other thing is that also really these questions are answered differently depending where you come from. So when I started engaging with Debora Vogel, and this was really, I was very young and there was almost no scholarship about her whatsoever. And there was little knowledge that she was a Yiddish, people knew, but nobody knew what actually. So her only book that was known was the Polish, self-translation, and her, a relationship with Schulz actually. But nobody questioned it because of Schulz actually. So nobody questioned the legitimacy of my engagement. And what happened actually is that my advisor, who wrote very dismissive things about Vogel, after he read my work, he'd say, actually he published an article in the best journal for literary studies in Poland, and he said, I learned a lesson. And this was not 2022, but early 21st century. So this was amazing actually. So this process also of the change that Allison's book is pushing forward, let's say, started earlier, and I think with our also different projects that we were doing and our colleagues and friends are doing. And here is another exciting step forward and a call for another change.
It occurs to me that one of the things that all of your answers, all of our answers are suggesting in this question of, are they any good, is that it's a challenge to the way in which we understand both what a minor language is and what a minor author is, right? I mean, this seems, not to quote Deleuze-Guattari on this, but what is a minority language in the context of Yiddish studies? And what is a minor author in the context of Yiddish studies? I've long ago given up on trying to answer that. And apparently so have you. No,
I was thinking because of Allison. Really, what does it mean to be minor in a minority culture? And then, and Allison also mentions it, and I was also thinking about it when I was writing my first book about Vogel. How she's actually thinking that this is a minority position, but on the other hand, it's a international language. And if you look at it and at her position, epistemological position from another angle, and it's actually becomes a privileged position, not only in this privileging, minority modernist take, but really it is simply on, if we start defining, the terms of minority and majority differently, it becomes something different. And this also comes up in my work on Polish-Yiddish cultural literary relations, because Polish writers were really, so not interested in minority cultures. Major Polish intellectuals suddenly, when they write to Opatoshu, who is in New York, they write, "Oh, you, the word writer, and we, tiny little Polish writers, could you help us publish in the U.S.?" So, I think, and this is also what Allison's book is about. It's about redefining the framework, redefining the terms we're using. And we don't need to define things. They can be somehow, they can remain undefined, and they can move, terms can move. And this is what Anastasia's work is great in showing how Vogel's, thought is on the move, and how it doesn't fit into the male definition of structure.
To chime in here, I think it's important to think about, as you mentioned, the term minority is so fraught, is so loaded. We've been discussing for a long time what it means and what it means to write in these languages that were, Jewish languages that were minority languages, if you consider the European context or the context of the Soviet Union, for example. And obviously, the positionality is a bit different if we speak about Hebrew literature in Palestine and later in Israel. I would suggest that, as Karolina was saying, Allison's work really challenges the frameworks that we have been working with. And not only does it challenge the term minority, if we consider the authors that Allison discusses, for instance, Elisheva Bikhovsky, who does not have a Jewish minority identity. And obviously she's not assuming a minority identity, but rather I would argue what she's doing is trying to stage what it means to become minoritarian. And when I say minoritarian, I would argue that it's imbued with certain agency. So basically, what does it mean to become minoritarian when one is marginalized, whether or not you belong to a minority identity or not? And I think this is really, Allison's important contribution. This question is also linked up again for me with this question of positionality. I think what Allison's work is doing is also quite refreshingly engaging with questions of readership and writership. So reading and writing. We have works and monographs in Yiddish studies and Hebrew studies that deal with women as readers of fiction. We also have works that deal with women as writers. But I think, what Allison is really doing is kind of showing that reading and writing exist on this boundary. And it's exemplified also, for instance, in her wonderful comparatist engagement with these women kind of, reading one another. I would say, her work is also about Debora Vogel reading Fradl Shtok, or, you could say sort of the genealogy, but also these women reading Gustave Flaubert and reading and rewriting, as for example, Dvora Baron in her feminist praxis of feminist translation of Madame Bovary. So I think, the contribution is not only obviously to the frameworks of Yiddish studies and Hebrew literary and cultural studies, but also more broadly to comparative literature and translation studies, and this question of minority writing, cosmopolitanism, national identities, and so on and so forth, which makes it so incredibly rich, and just opens new frameworks, new vistas for future scholars to engage with.
I just want to add one thing to that about how, one of the things I feel like with Karolina and Anastasia's work has really shown us with Vogel and with Auerbach is that women are also thinking intellectually about the central questions, and that in this interwar moment when minority is as a concept itself emerging and being theorized, it's exciting to say, wait a second, it's not just men and male intellectuals that are thinking and theorizing this, but the women are doing it in their writing. Some also, Vogel in her criticism is also asking and doing important things, and they've been really absent from that conversation for so long. So I think that, those terms are so fluid in that particular historical moment. And it's so interesting and exciting to think about the ways, whether it's Bikhovsky choosing Hebrew as this sort of minority gesture as a non-Jewish woman, or Vogel choosing Yiddish, or, even the way that some of these women do make conscious choices, as Goldberg does with Hebrew too, is really interesting. But I think it's important that these women are really asking those questions too. It's central to their projects.
This question also of women as readers that both you address, Allison, and that you asked about, Anastasiya, it's always struck me as rather odd that there is this assumption in Yiddish criticism that women read and men wrote, right? and women read poetry or they read novels because they had time or they were more emotional or I don't know what. There were all sorts of explanations for it. But there's absolutely no way to, almost all of Yiddish literature was serialized in the papers. It's impossible to know who was reading page 2 and who turned to page 5 first. That is the idea that there were women who read certain things and men who wrote and then read certain things. It seems to me so peculiar as to be almost laughable. So that I like Anastasiya, I very much appreciate this complication of the question of readership and writership. One of the other things that I know each of us has had to answer over time is why, and here I have to say that I'm about to do a little bit of true confessions, why women have been considered poets, if they're considered writers at all, right? Poetessen, and not prose writers. And the true confession is that many, many years ago, in my youth and ignorance, I made this argument as well, that women wrote poetry, but the world of novels and prose wasn't open to them, which now I have to say I'm embarrassed to have written, and I renounce entirely, but I'm struck by how strong that sense was. Right? All of us were given bibliographies at some point in our academic training, and almost none of them included women, and when they did, they included poets. Why do you think this has lasted so long, this myth of the Yiddish female genre?
Well, I have one theory about it, and I think this is, I'd be so curious to hear Anastasiya and Karolina coming from European contexts, because I think in the US, there's actually, in the post-war moment, and this is sort of why I'm interested in this for my next project, there's a consolidation of a masculine narrative of Jewish American writing that's also invested in translation. So it's like a Singer or Gimple the Fool appearing in the Partisan Review, and Bellow, and these figures kind of coalesce. And I think it's actually, there's a part of this is a response to the politics of McCarthyism and this idea of separating Jewish literature from being political and radical, and that anything feminist or women authored was suspect. So I do think that in the American context, that Cold War moment really establishes a translation culture that's that was so male identified. And that translation culture then had an enormous impact on what people read and got taught. And really, this is in the English language American context, the whole father and son and grandson narrative was also so appealing, right? So you have these two things happening on top of each other. Because I will say that when I was describing to colleagues in my English department, about my project and other fields in, Victorian and medieval and Renaissance, I mean, writing about women is so old that it's like, they're like, God, this project is so 1970s or 80s, and recovery is actually, it's dismissed because it's really truly already been done. But there's a delay in the American literary and both scholarly and cultural worlds that's really unique and different. And I do think that some of it does have to do with the Cold War and its history in the US.
Interesting. Is the situation similar in your European contexts?
I was really thinking about it because I worked also on Yiddish literary criticism, and I was trying to follow in more details the discussion about women writers, poets. English doesn't have those names, those feminine suffixes. And I was actually comparing the discussions that happened, and in their practices, exclusionary practices, they're very similar to the discussions that took place in the Polish literary criticism at that time. So basically in the interwar period. Of course, it happened earlier as well, but I was comparing the discussion that happened in the 1920s, 1930s. Also the changes, so that, for example, the discussion in the 1930s, if we look at Kadimodowski, is more concerned with social issues. And this follows really the pattern that we can see in the Polish literary criticism. But what happened is this discussion happens in Yiddish, really in the field of poetry, and in Polish in the field of prose. And I was fascinated by the way Auerbach, and Allison mentioned her essay on Fradl Shtok that was, as part of a series of essays, recover. I think it was really like a genealogical project, really like recovering women's voices in a broader project. So like this, not only translingual, but transnational feminist prose, because she's really juxtaposing Marta Ostensa with Fradl Shtok and with Eva Szelburg-Zarembina. So three different prose writers writing in different languages and really transnational in different cultural milieus. And I felt like what she's trying to do is to push this discussion really towards, in Yiddish, towards prose. This is not her only these are not her only articles about prose. So she was fascinated by the Polish discussion and bringing those names into Yiddish in her different reviews. And of course, she was never considered a literary critic. So if you're thinking about the history of Yiddish literary criticism, of course, we have Bal Machshoves and then Shmuel Niger, or Czarny today, but not in the patriarchal narrative. But there are no women writing literary criticism. They were journalists, they were poets writing reviews, and so on and so on. But this is really her project, and so we see it happen. That's what Allison actually said. So we really can theorize also and change those frameworks from within, reading and appreciating their work. Because what Auerbach is doing is she's just saying, well, this is something's wrong here, and I'm just want to not only bring in prose writers but change the terms of discussion. And I was thinking, why did it happen really in Yiddish? Because this discussion is so similar. I don't have a very good question. I mean, there are obvious questions, so female diction, sentimental poetry, but there is a parallel discussion going on, and similarly idiotic, and similarly really outrageous, and it happens, and it happens in the different discourse. So I don't have a good answer. I mean, I have some tentative answers, but really, I don't think there is a good explanation. We could search also simply in the earlier, literature in the pre-modern Old Yiddish literature. Perhaps there is, like identifying tchinas with women, and also the tradition, and also that is there present. Perhaps this is one of the things. The other thing would be perhaps also that the project of recovery of women's writing was, partly done by Ezra Korman, who published this beautiful anthology, and simply also, I mean, while, bringing so many writers to the public attention, he also petrified the terms of discussion, perhaps. So these are just parts and pieces of a process that probably requires more thinking.
Can we pick up on this question of tradition, which of course Allison's book challenges both by implication and directly, right? I mean, in Yiddish, it's a little tired to keep talking about the Zayde from the Yiddish literature, to say that that Shalom Aleichem calls Mendel Amoichas Forum the Zayde, and that everything is patriarchal. But we do have the Golden Kate, right? Which is a much stronger myth than I think we have given it credit for being, right? And the Golden Kate, this is really a question I want to ask about Allison's book. Once we challenge the Golden Kate, which suggests this kind of chain of the golden chain, which is hard to break, are we also questioning or letting go of such notions as lineage, right, inheritance, influence, right? This language of who influenced Fradl Shtok, right? Who were her, was she influenced by Flaubert, or did she influence Bergson? Who influenced whom? Have we reached a point, do you think, where these, the language of influence and of the chain and of even of generational, even of genealogy, perhaps, inherited history, have we reached some change in that in that conceptualization of Yiddish literary history? Allison, this is your, you can just say yes and we'll move on.
I mean, I think what I'll say about it is, now that I've written this book, you know, I'll come across really good scholarship, say, on Yiddish literature, and it'll have one woman in it, right? Like that we're still, that, and the reason I think we're still, so the chain, I feel like we're still stuck in, these are the great writers, and then now we know there's a woman. So what I hope, like, you know, after all the work that's collectively represented here, that we need to really challenge the whole assumptions that we have about Yiddish literary history, about this, you know, the Renaissance of Yiddish and the patriarchal narratives and the biographical stories as being, you know, because actually there's so many women writing really interesting things. And when we start to read, say, Vogel as someone thinking about exoticism and primitivism, or we're reading, you know, these other, you know, women writers, or Auerbach as truly an intellectual, then, you know, we need to turn to, like, we need to continue to make women available. People need to just start, people who haven't been reading women need to start reading women. And I guess the only way to make that happen is, you know, making the material available, right? So, Anita, you were talking about, you know, translating a serialized novel, right? Like, because also this is another problem when women published serialized texts. Those are just, you know, kind of only exist if you're going to go read microfilm in the archive. So we need to make more materials available as resources, because I do think that the narrative we have of Yiddish literary history is very tiny and it's very narrow, and it's been expanded. I mean, we're all doing this work of expanding it, but I don't think we're past it. But I see, no. I have hope. You know, I don't know what the rest of you think about your own feelings about the ways that your feminist scholarship has, you know, in Poland and abroad, like in Ukraine, has brought those changes about.
If I may say something, I believe that this is also a question of displacing you know, the norm, whether these women writing in Yiddish and in Hebrew, were they part of the norm or were they exceptional, right? This is the question that we always get asked as well. And I think what's so refreshing about your work, Allison, and you know, you're doing these case studies, but you are also weaving them together, not through a framework of direct lineage or, you know, genealogy, or sort of bowing to the male authority and the canon that was written and that was exclusionary, or perhaps inclusionary, but only to a certain extent, as with the case of Baron, for example. So I think, you know, you're really trying to push this boundary of the norm and the exception, and what it means in the case of these writers and many other writers, and kind of making visible and legible not only the tremendous work that they did, but also these absences, kind of, you know, these absences that are also very visible, that make you want to go and search for more and kind of find more.
Each of us translates, and in each of us is committed to what Allison is calling the feminist project, which I think is a good enough name for it. I mean, a good name for it. what do you see as the significance of translation at this particular moment in Yiddish studies? Obviously, we all think it's important because otherwise we're unlikely to have been doing it. But there has been pushback about all these translations, saying that the more we translate, the less likely it is that people will read in the original. I've gotten that. You haven't gotten that, Alice? I've gotten that sometimes.
No, I haven't heard that. That's really interesting.
And frankly, my experience is quite the opposite, that when people start reading works in translation, they're curious about what this would have sounded like in Yiddish, or what else is there that hasn't been translated. So I guess the broader question is, what is the cultural significance of translation into the various languages into which we translate these days?
If I may jump in, I think, that this is a very rich question, and obviously translation is also a practice. It's a feminist practice. It's a political practice. It's always deemed as being secondary to, let's say, original work, or this is obviously very problematic, this notion of being secondary. I think what Allison's book also shows in speaking about both I'll just briefly mention her chapter on Dvora Baron and her translation into Hebrew, as well as consideration of Baron's original work together. I think it kind of complicates this question of translation and what translation is. Is it an act of reading? Who can perform a translation? Allison reads the critics of Baron's translation, where they argue that her translation is not faithful to the original. It's a woman trying to push her agenda, basically, kind of smuggle her ideas about what this author was trying to say. And it also engages with this question of translation, historical notion of translation. When Baron was doing her translation, this was very much a project of also enriching the POLIN system, as translation studies scholars like Itamar Evan Sahar have been writing about, for example. And what does it mean, for this kind of feminist reading, a feminist translation, a translation imbued with agency, to become a definitive translation for a generation of readers and also writers. So this is to kind of historicize this question. And I think, what's really interesting about Allison's project is that you complicate this notion of translation as perhaps being secondary or derivative, or what it means to be faithful or not faithful to the original. Is it an act of reading? Is it an act of writing and rewriting? And how does it reflect upon one's original work, upon what's available to it in a literature, and I think this maybe not is not answering directly your question about translation of Yiddish in the present moment, which I'm sure we have a lot to say about, but I'll just probably conclude here and let others say something about translation in the current moment and what it means.
Well, one of the things that struck me, that I think has struck all of us, is that the current moment, if we take it for the last 2 decades, has seen a much broader bibliography of translations of women's writing than the last 20 years have seen, more than, certainly into English, than the previous 100 years. I can say with absolute certainty that is the case. So there's been a significant change here. And partly it's because feminist scholarship, not only in Yiddish, was so powerful, And we're finally getting to that work of recovery and of criticism. And the other thing that I would say is that for me, translation is an act of interpretation, first, foremost, and primarily above all things. But if I can just, one slight anecdote. When I was translating Kaja Molodowski's novel, there were lots of people, I was in Israel for part of this time, there were lots of people in Israel who loved Kaja Molodowski's poetry, who thought both her children's poetry and her modern, it was just wonderful poetry. And they were surprised that my Hebrew was good enough to translate a novel of hers, because everyone in Israel that I spoke to, except the academics, knew her Hebrew work, which had been translated by such luminaries as Leah Goldberg, for example. So that the translation takes on an absolute life of their own. And there were actually people who argued with me. What do you mean she wrote in Yiddish? So, yeah. But I don't want to short circuit this conversation. I do, however, want to remind people that they can post questions on the YouTube channel, and we may be able to get to them.
So I would just add to what has been said that I became more spectral. So please tell me when I start disappearing.
You're there.
So that for me, I mean, right now also we see that these translations gain more visibility in the public sphere. So they're reviewed in really like by major media outlets. For example, in Poland, the anthology I co-edited was reviewed by the Vogue of all, magazines. And so that's one thing. But for me also, I mean, it's about pleasure. For me, translation, interpretation, but also pleasure. So when I'm choosing texts, these are the texts that I like, and I want to share with my audience. And I have a very, limited audience compared to whatever you're doing in English. And so that's one thing. And this is also about changing the frameworks, challenging the frameworks in which Yiddish literature functions in different cultures. Well, translation to Polish can affect, let's say, Eastern European sphere plus sometimes part of Germany as well. But still, it's limited. It doesn't have the same effect as the English translation or German and French translation. But still, what I want to do is bring this pleasure I have, the reader's pleasure, to other audiences, which helps me, I think, challenge also the notions, of Yiddish as a literature that is important historically, because, well, we've heard it so many times. So yeah, it's a murdered language, and it's important, and we can learn about the history, etc., etc. And it's rarely discussed by the general public, not non-academic public, let's say, in aesthetic terms, really. So I think inserting pleasure into the game helps me do that. And the other thing is, and that's also part of Allison's project, is making those writers available helps us to push those, different also projects going on in the academia. So, how we think about literary history, how we think about those different terms we're using, the languages, the theories we're using. I mean, bring those texts into discussion, and that's simply that's a condition for this discussion. And that's what also I think Allison's book is about. It's a broader project. It moves beyond the Yiddish and Hebrew modernism.
Absolutely.
And I think what you're saying, Karolina, too, it kind of brings us back to this question of the fact that these authors were good authors, which we started with in the beginning, right? And in bringing this pleasure to readers who might not be necessarily in any way connected to Yiddish or academic circles or whatever. Right. These are just great writers that you might want to read.
I would just add to that. I love the detail about the pleasure of it. But for me, one of the interesting pleasures of translation is I felt like I got to know Fradl Shtok. She became so real for me when I was reading her stories and negotiating with them, and her depictions of these young girls' desires and pleasures and entering her language. And you create a kind of really sweet intimacy that is hard to describe, but it's something extraordinary. And it adds to my pleasure of reading her. And I really hope, when I did that translation and now at the brachas, like I want her to find the readers she was deprived of. I feel like I'm doing something remediative, and it seems, I was the desire to have people read her and to watch that happen, and in the, at least in the classroom, I get to see it, live. It's really exciting, and I'm glad that Northwestern was able to do both, and that they came out around the same time, so that if people want to know more about her, that then there's this kind of the idea of connecting the scholarship to the literature, because I think it's, as I'm sure as you were describing, when there isn't a lot written on a writer, it can be hard sometimes to be the first and to sort of engage in it. But once there's a conversation to enter, and there's a frame, and there's a clear body of text, it's more exciting. And so that work just needs to be done. Absolutely.
We're all committed to that, I think. There's a question, we're getting close to the end of our time, but there were a couple of questions, and one of them was, one question that was asked from the audience was, how important was religious faith for these women writing? And you could ask the same question of the men, I suppose. In Yiddish literature, the answer would be, well, I'll leave it to you, Allison.
I think what I would say about it is that for some of them are describing a world in which people were had faith and were grappling with it. So Shtok's story is about young women in the shtetl, but for most of these women, it was less about faith, was less about their aesthetic practice, but they were constantly grappling with a history of Jewish textual traditions that was rooted in faith and kind of organized by men, and then their own very secular aesthetic practices in which they were seeking to imagine textual worlds that could include women.
I'm struck by a lot, obviously, but when you said many of these women or most of these women, one of the things that I at least would like to stress is that we don't have a history of women writing Yiddish. We're nowhere near being able to make, in my opinion, nowhere near being able to make statements about what women wrote or how women wrote. That's just not, I don't think it's a goal, but it certainly isn't a historical moment where that can be done. But one of the things that I have been struck by in the works that I've just been reading, not quite randomly, but fairly randomly, is that the expectations of women's writing are undermined for most of these writers at every turn. That is, the happy ending, the marriage at the end, the coupling, the child, they may exist in the stories, but they're not the goal. And I think that's an interesting pushback to a lot of what has been written about women's writings and expectations of women's writings. I think we have to give Allison the last word, except for the one I'm going to say first, which is really this book, which has a transnational, a multilingual perspective, really is now the touchstone for discussions of women writing modernism in Hebrew and Yiddish and in other languages. And the work that will have to follow will be to find more of these women, to talk about more of these women, to analyze and translate more of the work that's out there that is so little known. But Allison, final word.
I just want to say this was so fun to get to have a conversation with all of you, and I hope we can get together and meet in person. And I think that this work of reading and thinking about women and taking them seriously is an ongoing project that we're all working on together, and it's exciting to see it just continue to develop. And that, for those of you watching and listening, there's lots of great Yiddish women writers for you to read. And so, they're easy to find and nowadays, and there's just really, it's an amazing body of literature. And so I encourage everyone to pick up women's books and read them.
Indeed. And I want to thank POLIN for hosting this book talk, and to each of the participants for contributing to it, and to all of you listening to it as well. Thank you very much, Allison and Anastasiya and Karolina. Thank you.
Thank you.